I was washed up. My marriage was a disaster. I was one more mistake away from losing my job at the plant. I was drinking myself unconscious to forget my problems and waking up suffocating under new regrets. I was hanging on by a thread. One November morning, the thread was cut. I'd passed out on the sofa at home after beginning drinking on Friday evening as soon as work had let out. I remembered the first bar I went in and how good that first drink tasted. It was a shot of rye, neat, and it lit a fire in my belly. I felt good, so I ordered another. After that, there was nothing, until my eyelids opened and the pain punched me in the face. I groaned. Hangovers are a lesson that getting drunk is a mistake. I had never been much for learning, but at that moment in time, I was all for taking on board the fact I had messed up. I would have done anything not to feel like that again. I would have gone on the wagon. I would have started eating healthy food. I would have even joined a gym. And maybe I would have. Maybe that was the moment my life could have been turned around. Only as I lay there reeling from the hurt in my head that had spread to my guts, I realized someone was standing over me. I tried to focus, and the blurry shapes rearranged themselves into the love of my life. Mary Lynn had never been a homecoming queen, but she had taken my breath away the first time I saw her. She had been kicking the wheel of her car because it had been flat, and once I'd got the oxygen flowing steady into my lungs again, I had gone over and, real gallant-like, fixed it for her. We were married 12 months later. She was 19. I was 20, which was far too young. I was 29 going on 60 that morning as I squinted up at her. I braced myself for her to start yelling at me, which was the main way we had been communicating for a while. Then I saw the tears streaking her makeup. "What is it?" I managed to say and tried to sit up. The pain transferred its attention to a point just behind my eyes. I shed a tear myself and blinked. "Look here," she said and pointed at the TV. The screen showed the inside of a store. It had been trashed real bad. The contents of its shelves were scattered across the floor. Broken glass lay in pools of a murky-looking liquid. A strip lamp hung down, just about attached to the ceiling by a stray wire. And the front window was smashed. A jagged-edged hole had been opened in the middle. Then a newsreader's bland voice told the viewers, "The shocked owner was met by this sight when he went to open up his family business at 5 a.m. this morning. Police would like to speak to this man who was captured on the shop's CCTV." A fuzzy image appeared, a man, unshaven and wild-eyed, standing amid the wreckage. It was me. I looked at Mary Lynn. "I don't remember," I began. She turned away. "Get out," she said, "and don't come back." If I had been stronger, I would have gone to the police station and turned myself in. I would have taken what I deserved for my unacceptable drunken behavior. But all I could dredge up inside me as I stumbled out into the street was a spiraling sense of self-disgust and fear. I'd lost my wife. I would lose my job. The prospect of prison terrified me. I needed to get away before someone recognized me on the rolling TV news and gave the police my name. That was all I could think of. I went to the coach station and bought a ticket that would take me away from everything I had ever known. It took 5 days to reach the last stop on the line, and then I started hitching rides. The drivers liked to talk. One man, who smelt worse than I did after a week in the same clothes, told me he knew a place that was hiring if I was looking for work. "It's a no-questions-asked type of place," he told me. He smoked constantly as he drove and kept his window wound down to flick the ash out. I was shivering with cold, and my teeth were chattering when I replied, "Sounds like my type of place. How much further is it?" "Well," he answered, pausing to light yet another cigarette, "you need to keep heading north till you hit the Arctic Circle and then keep going, beyond a town that old-timers like me still call Barrow. There are no signposts for the place I'm talking about, but it's as good a hiding place as any for a man who's running away." Saying this, he turned and gave me a wink. I shivered some more, and this time it was not because of the cold. I hadn't told this man about what had happened, hadn't breathed a word of it to anybody. I guess it must just have showed in my face. He dropped me off at an intersection. A gas station, a diner, and a motel huddled together around the road, as if they were trying to keep warm in the cold. By now, the bitter temperature felt like it had seeped into my bones, and I was not sure I would ever feel warm again. I checked into the motel. It was only early afternoon, but the sunlight was already bleeding out. The further north I had traveled, the shorter the days had become. That day had been fleeting, and darkness obscured the distance as I stood looking out of the motel room window. When I had registered using a false name and paid with almost the last of my cash, I had told the motel clerk I was hoping to head to the place north of Barrow that was taking on workers. He'd looked at me with a mix of disgust and sorrow, but had said nothing. The next morning, I was about to head out to the diner for what could be my last meal for a while due to my financial plight, when the clerk said, "There's a big fellow at the diner tucking into a mountain of grits, who works at the place you're looking for, if that's really the path you want to travel." A man with his feet on the ground would have heard alarm bells at that moment. I merely thanked him and strolled across to the diner. The light and the warmth I felt inside were welcome, and the smell of coffee, a lifeline. Most of the tables were empty, but I wandered over to one that was already occupied. Describing someone as a big fellow up here was a bit like describing a biker as that fellow in a leather jacket. But I was confident I had found my man. He must have been close to 7 feet tall. His face showed years of hard living. His head was shaved and he had a single crimson tear tattooed beneath his left eye. I asked him, "Do you mind if I join you?" He nodded and continued to shovel his breakfast into his mouth. I put it to him direct what I wanted, and after he had finished eating, he said, "You got that look about you of a man who wants a place to hole up while trouble makes it way by." This made me vow to not play poker with anyone for a long while. A few minutes in my company was clearly all it took to read me. "So I'll not try and dissuade you," the big fellow went on. "I'm foreman at the warehouse. If you want a job, I am willing to give you a chance. You can want to ride out with me." "Mighty grateful," I said, and followed him out to his truck. He moved with an easy grace that belied his size and did not seem to notice the cold. A few minutes in the wind, which had got up while we were in the diner, was enough to make me feel physically sick. My hands shook so bad as I tried to do up my seatbelt that I gave up. Observing this, the big fellow grinned. "There's an old fur-lined coat in the office at the warehouse. If it's not got up and walked out due to all the fleas living in it, you can borrow it." I smiled. I was so cold my face muscles were locking up, so it probably looked like a grimace. The big fellow kept grinning and started the engine. We drove through the darkness. There was a brief interlude of daylight, and the landscape it revealed was bleached of features. This was a barren, snow-covered land. Darkness soon returned, and the big fellow turned the headlights onto full beam. After long hours, lights came into view in the distance. As we came closer, I saw they were coming from a building. It was vast. The lights were fixed into the ground and ran the length of the building as far as I could see. There was nothing comfortable or welcoming about this display. We rattled to a stop in front of the building, and the big fellow turned to me. "Follow me," he said. Reluctantly, I left the shelter of the truck. The wind of earlier had dropped, and there was a captivating stillness. The air was freezing. I could feel it biting into my skin. This was no time to be hanging around. I hurried after the big fellow as fast as I could. He was punching a combination into a keypad by a door, and I did not want to be left outside. The door opened, and he let me pass, then pulled the door locked behind us. We entered an open, well-lit space that ran around 3/4 of the length of the building, I estimated. Stacks of containers stood here and there. There were no other people around, and as I kept pace with the big fellow, our footsteps were the only sound. At the end of the open space, we reached a partition wall. He punched in another code by another door and stepped through. A series of small rooms lay on either side of a narrow corridor. "That's my office," the big fellow said, pointing at one of the doors. A window opened out onto the corridor, and I could see a desk and chair, folders, books and drawers. No sign of a laptop or other electronic devices. A white board was covered in writing divided into columns by hand-drawn lines. I was about to ask what exactly it was they did at the warehouse, then remembered what the man who had first told me about this place had said. It's a no-questions-asked type of place. And the big fellow had not asked my name, had not asked for a social security number. Anything. I figured I needed to return the favor if I wanted to work there. That did not stop me wondering, of course, and I almost immediately thought there must be something illegal happening. We had reached a small room with a fold-up bed and a couple of bare shelves. "You'll be sleeping here," the big fellow said. "Try and get some rest. You'll be pulling 12-hour shifts and the first one starts in under 6. I'll leave that coat just outside." With that, he headed off. I lay on the bed and did not think I would get a moment's sleep. My mind was racing about exactly what shady things were taking place. Was I at a distribution hub for hard drugs? Or maybe their stock in trade was illegal weapons, or chemicals sold in bulk and in no way approved by the FDA. Whatever was going on, the location meant there would be no prying eyes. It felt to me, though, as if the warehouse was locked up for the winter. Come spring, the network would reopen. But for now, the building was still, enveloped in a wilderness beyond which a different world existed. One of bustling cities and the internet, of Friday night drinks and shopping malls. One which was just a memory. "Rise and shine, boy," a voice said, and I opened my eyes. I must have drifted off after all. The man who was standing looking down at me appeared to be in his 40s. He wore a long coat which reached down to his calves. His hair was completely gray. A fat scar ran the length of one of his cheeks. As with the big fellow's tear tattoo, no questions meant how he got this had to remain a mystery. That was probably for the best, I decided. Now I had had time to think. I was realizing what a jerk I had been. Running all the way out here to this strange place because I had panicked and freaked out. Before, I had been looking at charges for criminal damage, something like that. I was no lawyer. But now I had the feeling I was a bit part player in some major operation. As soon as I could, I would get out of there, get myself home and face the music. Scarcheek clearly did not share the big fellow's habit of smiling easily. "You going to shift it, boy," he said with a sneer. "I've got to show you the ropes before I get my head down. Come on." He pointed one of his thumbs at the door. I went with the flow. He took me outside where he started by showing me the generator sheltered around the rear of the building. "This beast is more important than your mama," he told me. "It's connected to a control panel inside where we set the levels for the exterior and the internal lights, and without it, we got no light." "Apart from in the hours of daylight," I chipped in. He looked at me like I was a complete idiot. "Boy," he said, "we are in the polar night now. The sun has set for the last time for 2 months, and it will be dark 24 hours a day for the next 67 days. I wrapped my arms around myself. I was mighty thankful for the coat the big fellow had left for me. It was worn and filthy, but it was fur-lined and had taken the edge of the cold when I had first stepped outside. As I took on board what Scarcheek had said, The comfort offered by the coat seemed to fall away. There was no way I could handle 2 months of darkness, apparently oblivious to my growing misery, but more likely simply not caring. Scarcheek began to list a daily routine of maintenance checks I would have to do. Then he said, "And when the road can be used again, we—" "What?" I spluttered. Again, he gave me the "what kind of fool are you" look and said, "We're going nowhere until the sun rises again in January." He carried on giving me my instructions, but I was no longer listening, and by the time he left me to begin my shift, my mood was as bleak as my surroundings, and I worked through my checklist without paying much attention to what I was doing. One of my tasks was to do a manual check of all the exterior lights. I stepped outside to be met by the glare of the lights. They showed the face of the building in all its grimness and reached out for dozens of feet across the empty, snow-covered ground, illuminating nothing. I began to trudge around the building. I started off by trying to walk with the wind at my back, but soon abandoned that. The way the wind swirled meant my face kept being exposed no which way I turned. It was cruel. After what felt like an age of this punishment, I had almost completed my circuit of the building and was getting up the courage to take a hand out of my coat pocket to enter the door security code when I thought I noticed a movement in the distance. Was something out there, skirting the edges of the lights? Yes. I caught sight of a silhouette, a shape moving rapidly on all fours. It must, I guessed, have been a wolf, or maybe a bear. I had no idea what kind of creatures lived in this bleak and freezing wilderness. Mean ones, I decided, and not ones I wanted a close encounter with. I turned to the keypad and hurriedly punched the code in. Back inside, I was working through the rest of the list when the big fellow walked up. I noticed he had a holster on his belt and wondered why anyone would be carrying out here. Once more, though, no questions won the day. He smiled at me and said, "Glad to see you doing such a great job." "Sure," I said morosely, "though I wish you'd told me I would be stuck here for months." He smiled. "You will make a good wage while you're here," he said. "And with no channels to communicate with the outside world, there will be no one hassling us. I would have thought that suited you just fine." "Yeah," I replied. "We're living the dream, the three of us, and whatever it was I saw outside." The smile stayed on his face, but there was a harder edge to his expression when he said, "They're a creature that's particular to these parts. I've only ever seen them from a way off, but even so, I would say they are ugly SOBs. They hide from the light and embrace the darkness. Now there is no natural light because of the polar night. They roam freely through the wilderness." I was really not liking the sound of this, so much so that I ditched the no questions approach. "Are they dangerous?" I asked. "Not as dangerous as one of these," the big fellow said, and patted his holster. "And now the polar night is set in, you should be properly equipped. Come with me and I'll get you kitted out." "Thank you," I said quietly, uncertainly. A while later, my shift over, I trudged back to my sleeping quarters. I passed Scarcheek, who was just beginning his shift. "You should have warned me about the creatures," I muttered. A sneer drifted onto his face before he told me, "They won't come near you while the lights are on. And if there's a problem now, well, you can just draw and aim. They are critters and we are men. We are the alphas. You got that, boy?" I glared at him but did not reply. He laughed to himself and added, "Now me and my best friends are going to check on the generator." Like a desperado in an old cowboy movie, he swept back the sides of his long coat and I saw the pair of holsters attached to his belt. Then he carried on his way. I was frustrated with the big fellow, and I was really starting to loathe Scarcheek. And I was only one day into the polar night. I managed an hour's sleep in total and felt like a total wreck as I started my second shift. I began by checking the exterior lights. Each glowed reassuringly as I walked past them, till I reached the last one, which was flickering. I tried to think back to what Scarcheek had told me I should do if this happened, and drew a blank. He must have run over this while I was feeling sorry for myself and not listening. I tapped the perspex casing of the light with my knuckle and told it not to disrespect me. "I'm the alpha boy," I said. Somehow, my tapping had done the trick, and the light went back to emitting a steady beam. Laughing at how low I had sunk, I decided to go and find the big fellow and tell him what had happened. Maybe there was a problem which needed a proper fix. I made my way to the door and was just about to enter the security code to open it, when the faulty light flickered once again, then went out completely. Then the one next to it did the same. "Damn," I said, then stood and watched open-mouthed as one by one all the lights I could see died, leaving me in the dark. And I wasn't alone. There was something moving out there. One of the creatures. I was sure of it. Unless it was my imagination? I told myself to focus. All I needed to do was enter the security code, then I could head inside, find the big fellow and Scarcheek, and one of them would know what to do. Only I couldn't see past the tip of my nose. I would need to do this by touch. Not a problem, I assured myself, and pressed what I thought were the right keys. Nothing happened. I swore under my breath. Turned around. I'd heard a new sound. Snow crunching underfoot. Under paw, I corrected myself, which really did not help. I returned my attention to the keypad. I was shivering badly now as well as operating blind. I pressed again. There were 5 numbers, and then the hash key. Wrong again. I cursed. Hellfire! Tried to enter the code a 3rd time. The sounds behind me were getting louder. There was no denying it, no blaming it on the wind or my imagination. There was something moving in the darkness, and it was heading my way. I placed my fingertips on the keys. They were cold metal. So cold it felt like they were burning my skin. I ran my finger along the keys, ignoring the pain, and counting out where I was, and one by one pressed the numbers, ending with the hash key. There was a click. I turned the handle and the door opened. I exhaled, stepped inside, smiled. The lights were still on in here. I began to run, began to shout. "The lights have gone off outside!" The big fellow was the first to appear. "Slow down," he said. "What are you saying about the lights?" "Flickered," I gasped. "Went out, then back on, then nothing, all dark." I hadn't seen Scarcheek come out of his sleeping quarters, but there he was. "What have you done, boy? You idiot," he snapped. "Nothing," I protested. "They just went off one by one." The big fellow held up his hands. "Easy there," he said. "It will just be a glitch. Some problem in the system which can be easily fixed." I nodded. That sounded good to me. Problem sorted. Then I remembered. "There was something out there," I said. "It was coming towards me." "Ah, yes, the creatures," the big fellow said. "Let's not worry about them. They will keep to the darkness outside and not try and come in here while the inside lights are on." He smiled his by now familiar smile, and I started to feel better. Then he added, "And of course, because the doors are closed, they can't get in anyway." I stopped feeling relieved, started panicking again as I tried to remember. Had I closed the door behind me? I swore. "What is it, boy?" Scarcheek asked, his eyes narrowed. I think I left the door open," I replied. "You heap of worthless junk." Scarcheek spat these words out, then flicked back his coat, and with a lighting quick movement, drew. "I got this," he said, and began to walk in the direction of the door I'd left open. "You go with him," the big fellow said. Give him back up. I'll be along in a minute." Then he ran towards his office. I did the last thing I wanted to do. I headed back towards the open door and the things waiting in the darkness. I got there to find Scarcheek standing in front of the open door, both of his sidearms blazing. He was firing out into the darkness and loving it. "Yee-ha!" he cried when he ran out of ammo, then reloaded and let rip again. I wanted to cover my eyes. I wanted him to stop, but he would not have listened to me. Thankfully, the big fellow caught us up. "That's enough," he yelled when Scarcheek had once again emptied his chambers. Scarcheek scowled but did not argue. The big fellow had brought a torch with him, and he moved towards the open door and turned it on. A powerful beam cut through the darkness outside and revealed a hideous scene. Bodies lay across the ground, their blood staining the snow. I realized for the first time that the creatures were not wolves or bears, or any animal that I had known existed. Their corpses were around 6 foot long, and they were hairless. Their skin was very pale, but lined with darker veins, which protruded. I could see the outline of their ribs as well, the sharp lines of their shoulder blades. They had paws, but no ears or tails. From the way they had fallen after being cut down by Scarcheek, I could not see their faces. And there was more of them out there, still very much alive. I could make out dark, restless shapes, keeping just out of reach of the torch beam. "You killed them," I whispered, horrified. "I sure did, boy," Scarcheek replied. "That's what you get for loitering around these parts." Then he turned to the big fellow and said, "Isn't that right?" Instead of agreeing, the big fellow sighed and said, "You hothead. You've done shot up my truck as well. The engine's hold and it'll take a heap of fixing." Then the big fellow sighed again and closed the door. My shoulders slumped in relief, and I managed a small smile. At least now the door was closed. There was no way for the creatures to get in, even if the inside lights failed as well. "Let's go see what the problem is," the big fellow said, and I was happy to follow him. The control panel was on a wall at the far side of the main open space, just before the partitions began. Dozens of switches and dials were set into it. The big fellow studied it, then frowned. "It's a connection issue," he said. "Most likely, a cable has come loose." I jumped in with a question laced with hope. "But we can fix it?" "We sure can," he answered. "Once the connection is back, all you need to do to make the lights come back on is flip this here switch." He placed a hand on a red lever in the center of the panel. "It is real simple." "Great," I said. "So where's the loose cable?" "Outside," he replied. My guts tightened, and all of a sudden my mouth was so dry I could not swallow. When I said, "What?" the word came out so quietly I doubt either of them heard. They were already busy anyway. Scarcheek was reloading, and the big fellow was bringing out 2 more of the torches and holding them out. I wanted to protest, to say, "There is no way I am going out there." But instead, I meekly took one of the torches from him. Once again, I must have been broadcasting my feelings. The big fellow looked down at me, looked me in the eye, and said, "Has anyone ever told you you have a negative attitude?" Scarcheek chuckled at this. I had no reply and trailed after them as they headed back to the door that had been safely closed 15 minutes before. It opened silently and, holding their torches in front of them, they stepped out. I followed. The first thing I did was almost fall over one of the corpses. I steadied myself. "Move in circles as you walk, pointing your torch forwards," the big fellow told me. "That way the creatures will keep their distance." "Uh-huh," I replied, and span slowly round in a circle. The beam of my torch picked out yet more of the creatures as they flinched and moved back, too quickly for me to see more than a pale limb. I kept circling and moved forwards as I did so. The light continued to keep them at bay. The mouth of one was momentarily illuminated for a second, and I glimpsed bared teeth. Then it slipped back into the cover of darkness. Our progress was slow, tortuously so to me, but eventually we reached the cluster of cables and equipment, at the heart of which sat the generator. "You two give me cover," the big fellow said, and as Scarcheek and I created crisscrossing barriers of light, he got to work. After 10 minutes or so, he grunted. "I think that's fixed it," he said. "Now let's get back inside." We retreated back towards the door. "Not far now," I said, and then I stumbled. Fell. I landed on the corpse I had tripped over. My torch hit the ground, the beam pointing impotently upwards. The beams of the others' torches hit me in the eye. They'd seen what had happened, and both cursed me. "I'm sorry," I said. "I'm sorry." The corpse was still warm, its skin hard where my hands touched it as I struggled to push myself upwards, until I felt something tug at my leg. Then a shot rang out, close and loud. I flinched but managed to grab hold of my torch and swing it towards my leg, where I saw the body of a creature. The top of its skull had been split open, and it wore a mask of blood. It twitched, then fell still. I felt something pulling at my collar, looked up. It was the big fellow, and he was hauling me to my feet with one hand. In his other, he held the weapon he had used to dispatch the creature before it had bitten me. Next to him, Scarcheek was moving his torch rapidly in a circle encompassing the three of us. A solid wall of shadowy figures encircled us. Held back only by the light, I knew. "Get back to back. We rotate together," the big fellow said. I did as I was told, and we resumed our journey of a few feet to the door and the sanctuary beyond. The big fellow entered the code, and I saw the light inside as he opened the door. I followed him into the warehouse. Scarcheek lingered. The big fellow hissed at him. "What are you doing?" "One more for luck," he said and drew. I saw one of the dark shapes fall, Scarcheek grinning and lowering his torch as he turned and stepped towards the door. Then his body tensed, his eyes turned upwards, and his knees buckled. He fell face forwards onto the ground, and I saw the bloody gash that ran the length of his spine. I saw extended claws. They were razor sharp, tipped with blood. Then the creature scurrying away from the light of my torch. "We have to help him!" I yelled, and lurched forwards towards Scarcheek. "Leave him, you fool!" the big fellow shouted. "He's dead! We need to get this door closed!" "We can't just leave him!" I yelled back. "No!" The big fellow screamed the word at me, and I retreated back through the open door, just as the inside lights flickered, then failed. It was dark inside now as well. I cried out, "You didn't fix it! You made it worse!" "Go to hell!" the big fellow screamed. I turned my torch towards him, saw he was trying to close the door, but couldn't, because the creatures were coming in. I scrambled backwards. My torch made patterns on the floor where it hung in my faltering grasp. I swung it back upwards, to where the big fellow was. The creatures jumping up at him were reaching his throat easily. Big as he was, their claws were slashing at him. Blood spurted out. The light of my torch made them break away, and I hurried towards the big fellow. He was staggering, holding his right hand to his wounds. Blood flowed through his fingers. With his other hand, he pointed his torchlight at the open door, keeping more of the creatures from coming in, I realized. I began to turn my torch in a circle. "The switch," I said. "Will it still work?" He looked at me and tried to speak. Blood bubbled inside his mouth, then began to spill out. His legs buckled, and he fell. I stood there helplessly and looked down at his body. My hand was shaking so much, the beam from my torch jerked about crazily. I forced myself to hold it steady and once more began to move it in a circle. I saw teeth bared, claws raised, and the arched backs of the creatures as they approached me. I saw them in glimpses, in moments, as the beam of light passed over them. They were 10 feet away, 8. I could not keep them all at bay. In seconds, they would be on me, and I would be dead, cut to shreds. I turned and ran. The beam played across the floor as I raced towards the control panel. Behind me, I could hear them running, bearing down on me. But I could not look back. I could not stop. I ran. I was struggling to breathe. Sweat flew from me, and I ran. I ran for my life. I threw myself at the control panel and, guided by the torchlight, found the switch. If it worked, I had a chance. If it didn't, I was history. These thoughts raced as I grasped the switch and pulled it down. The lights flickered, then burst into life. I turned to look back at the creatures. They were everywhere, hundreds of them, crouched on all fours throughout the warehouse. Their eyes were red and, I realized, helplessly exposed to the glaring light, as they had no eyelids. Their snouts were long and as pale as the rest of their abhorrent bodies, and everywhere their veins stood raised. In the ones nearest me, I swear I could see the blood pulsing in them. They bared their teeth, reared up, but they were raging now at an enemy they could not overcome, the light. And they rushed from the warehouse, scrambling over each other to get out. I waited till the last one had gone, then made my way back to the open door and stepped outside. I could see the lights around the exterior of the building were working again, and the creatures that had come so close to taking my life were almost out of sight. That was 2 weeks ago. It is December the 2nd, and I walk through the deserted warehouse, the light illuminating my every step, and all I have left to do is think. The polar night ends on January 23rd. The sun will rise. There are still 51 days to go till then. Outside, the darkness waits.